First of all, welcome to this webinar entitled 5LD01. It's a support webinar for learners and centres. The webinar is one of a series of webinars provided to support the units of the CIPD suite of qualifications. The webinar supports those with an interest in learning and development and who are working towards the Associate Diploma in Organisational Learning and Development, and for those who are supporting learners working towards this qualification. This particular webinar is one of a set of 3 that have been particularly designed to support the specialist pathway units of the Associate Diploma in OLD. The specialist units are 5LD01, Support Informal and Self-Directed Learning, 5LD02, Design Learning and Development Programs to Create Value, and 5LD03, Facilitate Structured Learning and Development Activities for Groups. In this case, we are looking at 5LD01, so let's have a look at what that unit involves. 5LD01 takes a fairly general look at how learning takes place within organisations. It has 2 areas of focus, the first being informal learning, in that it recognises that much of the learning that takes place in organisations, as anywhere, happens quite informally and organically, and that this usually takes place in the form of individuals learning from others or with others. And it's about individuals being able to access learning content socially as and when required. The other area of focus is self-directed learning, which might also be informal. There may also be a formal element, self-directed learning. But in self-directed learning, we are thinking about how individuals want to take control of their own learning, how they control the pace, possibly the type and source of learning that they choose, fitting that in with their personal schedules and lifestyles. So the unit focuses on those 2 areas of learning, and to quote the description of the unit, this unit explores the skill of supporting informal and self-directed learning and the practical steps that can be taken to encourage these forms of learning and gain the many benefits that both these processes can bring for both organisations and for the individuals who work within and with them. Because the assessment briefs aligned to units are regularly updated, it's really important that you are working with the correct assessment brief. The image you can see here is the front page of the current 5LD01 assessment brief and is the one you should be working with. You can be certain of this by checking the assessment ID, which as you can see there is CIPD 5LD01 2401, meaning this is the first assessment brief issued in 2024. There are a couple of things to note at the bottom of that page. You can see there in those 3 bullet points, first of all, confirmation that this brief was issued in June 2024, and therefore, as per the second bullet point, that it will expire in June 2026. The third bullet point is particularly important in that centres and learners should note that the very last moderation window for assignments done against this brief is September 2026. So what's in this brief? All the assessment briefs will be made up of a number of tasks. In the case of the 3 pathway units, you will find a pattern of tasks in that there are 2 tasks in each brief, and that the first task will seek to assess your detailed knowledge and understanding of the topic, in this case of informal and self-directed learning, and the second task will seek to assess your application of knowledge and understanding in relation to the topic. So It's really important that you read the two tasks in advance. Sometimes task 2, which in this case is about curation, but sometimes task 2, the applied task, might need some forward planning. And so it makes a lot of sense for you to read the whole assessment brief, get the big picture of what's going to be required before you start. Task 1. This is the questions, the knowledge task. And the instruction for this task is that to complete the task, you should provide a written response to 9 questions. You should note that you have approximately 2,700 words to respond to those questions, but that does not mean that you have to apportion those words equally. Some of the questions might require longer responses than others. So again, read the whole task, check what's required, get a feel for what might need more words than others before you start, and so that you're not left with 2 questions to do and no words left. So think about how you're going to respond. It's very, very important that you take note of that guidance in red at the bottom of this slide. And that's about remembering that at this level in particular, it's very important that you make appropriate use of wider reading. You can use this to expand your responses and illustrate key points in your answers. At this level, we do want to see that you are reading around the subject, that you are reading widely. So make sure you bring that into your responses. There are 1 or 2 assessment criteria that do not require evidence of wider reading. That's not to say you can't include it. It might enhance your response, but you wouldn't be penalised for not including it on those assessment criteria where it particularly states it's not required. But these are exceptions. For most of the assessment criteria, and therefore for most of the questions, you are required to show evidence of wider reading. Starting on task 1, we said there were 9 questions, and we're now going to look at the first of those. That question says, the terms formal learning and informal learning are used to describe different approaches to learning in the workplace. Explain what is meant by each of these. So we have the 2 terms there, formal learning and informal learning, and we have the command verb in that sentence, which is explain. So before you even start to explain these, you really need to clarify in your own mind what they mean. When we think about formal learning, you might think around concepts such as structured programs, learning events that are planned, courses, workshops, accredited programs, etc., etc. Whereas with informal learning, you're going to think around learning that takes place more naturally, that's unplanned. You might use some of the terminology that's around, such as in the flow of work. You might also think about how, although these 2 are different and can be distinguished, formal learning and informal learning, how the 2 do often overlap, how they do often work together. You may have structured aspects to informal learning, you may have informal learning as a follow-on from structured learning, etc. So whilst you do have to take these 2 concepts and describe them separately, don't worry about the fact that there is some overlap. In fact, it's quite good for you to show your knowledge of how the 2 can work together. It's also important here that you do think about your wider reading. What do others have to say about these 2 terms? What examples can you bring in? Are there any theories around this? There are certainly theories around this. So think about what you can bring in, how you can show that you have read around the topic. So that's question 1, which responds to assessment criteria 1.1. Question 2. Question 2 takes us into the theoretical background and starts by saying that there are many theories of human learning. With reference to 2 of these, discuss how people learn from and with others in a workplace context. So in question 2, we are looking very much at this theoretical underpinning of our topic. And there are many, many theories to go at here. Complex areas, but areas that we need to be aware of. Theories by, for example, Bandura, Vygotsky, John Dewey, Reg Revans, many more. So choose two. It doesn't have to be from the examples there. Choose two that you find of interest, that you think relate to human learning, that you can relate to and are happy to write about. So pick two theories, and remember that command verb here is discuss. So you are discussing those, well, you're discussing how people learn from and with others, but with reference to those theories. So you're bringing in your view of how people learn from and with others, but referencing those theories. Remember that command verb is discuss, and remember that you're talking about a workplace context. Lots of theories about human learning relate to child development or learning in an educational context. So remember to apply what you're talking about to the workplace context. So it's good to bring in some examples there, examples of how people learn from and with others in the workplace. Use examples to bring your response to life. So that is question 2, and that meets assessment criteria 1.2. Question 3. So whereas the first two questions had a leaning towards informal learning, question 3 is very much about self-directed learning. And the command verb here is to explain. So we're talking about explaining self-directed learning. Lots of theories here again, lots of things you can bring in to show wider reading. So you might talk about theories by Knowles, Hayes and Kenyon, Decky and Ryan, theory of self-determination. You might talk about the concept of self-management of learning. So from your reading, what does self-directed learning mean to you? And you're asked to explain that. And as we've said, making reference to wider reading. And then again, bring that explanation to life by building in examples of how this might take place in a workplace. So how might self-directed learning take place in a workplace? It might be informal, it might be ad hoc accessing of learning, self-directed, so an individual decides what they want, when they want to learn, how they want to learn, and they access it in a very informal way. There may be self-directed learning in a more formal capacity where individuals can access qualifications or formal courses, but that they control themselves. So to an extent, they control their own choice, pace of learning, etc. So question 3, the focus is on self-directed learning, and it requires you to explain it and to give examples. And that will meet assessment criteria 1.3. Question 4. In question 4, we're asked to assess the potential benefits and risks of informal learning and self-directed learning for both individuals and organisations. So there's quite a lot of different parameters to consider there, and we will look at that in a moment. But before we do, I just want to point out the sentence in red font there, that there is no requirement to include evidence of the use of references to wider reading for this question. Mentioned this right at the beginning of this webinar, that there are 1 or 2 questions, which each question is an assessment criteria. So there are 1 or 2 assessment criteria stroke questions where you are not required to include evidence of reference to wider reading. It doesn't really, that's not to say you can't, but there's no need to. So you have so much to deal with here. You probably don't want to bother with references to wider reading. If you do, that's great. That might enhance your response, but you would not be penalised here if you didn't reference any wider reading. So let's get back to the question. So we've got all those parameters to consider. We've got benefits and risks, we've got informal and self-directed, and we've got individuals and organisations. So how you go about this is up to you. There are many different ways you could do this. One way suggested here, I might have taken individuals and organisations separately, and within that could provide a sort of table as per that illustration, in which you look at the benefits and risks of informal learning and self-directed learning for individuals, and then another table in which you look at the benefits and risks of informal and self-directed learning for organisations. However, in this kind of assignment, a chart with lots of sort of one-word bullet point entries isn't really enough. So although you might include that table, it would then make sense to take some of the strongest ideas from that brainstorm, essentially, take some of those strongest ideas and just expand them a little bit into full writing. And remember, you're talking here about the benefits, so you might just focus on the key benefits and the key risks in both scenarios. So that's just a suggestion of how to approach this question. You don't have to do it that way. It's up to you how you do it, as long as you include all those things, benefits and risks of informal and self-directed for individuals and organisations. So that's question 4, and that meets assessment criteria 1.4. Question 5. Question 5 moves us to a very practical viewpoint, and it asks us to explain the steps an organisation can take that will encourage informal learning in the workplace. So what can an organisation do to help informal learning take place? So a couple of things to be aware of there. First of all, that you're explaining again, and that you're talking about what an organisation can do to encourage informal learning, and we're talking about a workplace context. It's worth noting as well, that red font there, that this is another of the assessment criteria stroke questions where there isn't an actual requirement to include evidence of wider reading. That doesn't mean you can't. You can do, but if you choose not to here, as it is a very practical question, you would not be penalised for not including it. So getting back to the question, the command verb is to explain. So again, before we explain anything, we need to be very clear in our own mind what we're explaining. So we're explaining the steps an organisation can take. So what could an organisation do to make informal learning take place more readily? So you might think steps that are connected to the culture of the organisation. It might be about, within that culture, does the organisation allow time? Are there people around who might naturally help, maybe not in a formal way, but might naturally support learning? For example, are there coaches around the workplace? Are there mentors? Are communities of learning encouraged? So think about that informal learning, and although it's informal, there are steps we can take around that learning that will make it happen more readily and more easily. So it's up to you to think about steps an organisation can take. There's no number on that, but certainly you're looking at plural there, so you're looking at least 2, probably 3, 4, maybe more than that, steps that the organisation can take. Question 6 is really a mirror of the last question, except this time the focus is on encouraging self-directed learning. Again, note that evidence of wider reading isn't essential here. So we're explaining those steps again. So what could an organisation do? Well, again, you might think around steps connected to culture. What sort of culture would encourage self-directed learning? How could an organisation encourage it through giving resources, be that time or actual learning options? What could an organisation do that would make individuals more likely to access learning and to access learning that they manage for themselves? So again, question 6, what steps can an organisation take which will encourage self-directed learning? So something to think about there, quite a substantial question, lots of steps that could be brought in. So use your thinking, your knowledge, your reading, your imagination to consider what an organisation could do there. So that's question 6, and that meets assessment criteria 2.2. Question 7. This moves to a slightly different slant now. So question 7 asks us to assess how digital and technological innovation is encouraging and enabling informal and self-directed learning. So before we start assessing how digital and technological innovation is encouraging learning, we need to be clear in our own mind about what we mean by digital and technological innovation. So clarify your own thinking here. You don't need to separate those into two different things. I would take digital and technological innovation as one thing. It's technological development. So clarify your own thinking around that concept, and then once you're clear about what we mean, then you can assess how that is encouraging and enabling learning, both informal and self-directed. So it might be quite useful to take those separately, look at how technological development is encouraging and enabling informal learning, and then how it is encouraging self-directed learning. In both cases, you might consider things like access to learning, speed of learning, might be about attractiveness of learning, about engagement of learning. Whatever you think, how is technological development encouraging and enabling informal and self-directed learning? So as well as assessing that, you should also give examples, bring it to life. Give examples of how that technology is making learning easier or better, or as you're assessing, there might be examples where it works against learning. It's up to you, your assessment of how technological development is both encouraging and enabling those two forms of learning. So that's question 7, and that meets assessment criteria 2.3. Moving on to question 8. Now question 8 begins with a statement, and this kind of sets the context for you really. So it talks about formal and group learning. So this is different to what we're dealing with, but it's showing a comparison here. So formal and group learning often involve some built-in reflection activities. So often in formal and group learning, the facilitator will lead or encourage some kind of reflection at the end of the learning. But obviously that's not always the case with informal and self-directed learning, because there's no one there to manage and ensure that reflection of that learning takes place. So thinking about that difference, we're now being asked to consider two strategies which we could employ in a workplace context, which would allow individuals to reflect on and measure the impact of their informal and self-directed learning. So we're thinking about how can we encourage individuals not to lose the benefits of that learning, but to reflect on it and measure, in very general terms, the impact of the learning that's taking place. So for anyone who keeps CPD records, this will be very, very relevant, because you will be regularly reflecting on learning that takes place that isn't always formal or group learning. So you should be able to relate to this question. So when it comes to strategies, remember you're talking about the workplace context. It's strategies for supporting individuals, not a group. You've not got a group here, not the facilitator of a group. You're thinking about how to support individuals. And you're supporting them to reflect on and measure the impact of their informal and self-directed learning, not formal learning. And you're asked to discuss this. So you might be able to bring in what other people think, but essentially we want to know what strategies you could use as an L&D professional in an organisation to encourage individuals to capture, reflect on and measure the impact of that learning that's taking place that isn't formal learning. So that's question 8, and that relates to assessment criteria 2.4. Moving on now to the last question in task 1, we're asked to explain what we mean by the term curation of learning resources. And we're also asked to give 3 key principles which underpin how curation should be done. So, curation. What do we mean by curation in a learning context? You need to think about that. For me, I find the easiest way to explain curation is to think about what curation means in other contexts. When someone is curating art in a gallery or pieces in a museum, what does curation mean? But then apply that idea to learning. What does curation of learning resources mean? Be careful, it's not necessarily creating learning resources, which seems to be a mistake sometimes made, that when we talk about curation of learning resources, learners think that that is about creating learning resources. It isn't. So think about for yourself, what does curation of learning resources actually mean? So you need to then explain what that means. So bring in your wider reading, bring in examples, and along with that, what sort of key principles would underpin that curation of learning resources. So you might think about principles connected to relevance, access, quality, combination, copyright, etc., etc. Up to you. We want at least 3 key principles that relate to how curation of learning resources should be done. So that's question 9, and that meets assessment criteria 3.1. When you have completed all 9 questions, you should have completed task 1. So remember that you had 9 questions to answer and approximately 2,700 words in which to do that. And remember as well that you should have made use of wider reading within those responses. However, if you've done all that and you've done it to the best of your ability and to your satisfaction, that's task 1 complete, and we can now move on to task 2. Task 2. We said at the beginning that within this assessment brief there were 2 tasks. This was the pattern for the 3 L&D pathway units. So that there will be 2 tasks, that the first would be about assessing knowledge, whereas the second one would be a practical activity. So in this case, for LDO1, the practical activity is for you to curate some resources. So reading the instruction there, this task seeks to assess your ability to curate a range of complementary, that's an important word, complementary learning resources, and to make them available by an appropriate method or platform. So to complete the task, you are asked to read the scenario below and then follow the task instructions. So let's look at that scenario first of all. So in the scenario, you work in an L&D team in a large organisation, and a number of people in your organisation are currently learning about a particular subject which will help them to develop their work performance. We have a little subnote there saying that you can decide on the subject yourself. So you can choose something that interests you or that you understand particularly well. It can be something very specialist or very technical. If there isn't a particular specialist or technical thing that you're interested in, you could go for something quite general, such as team leading, but you can decide on the subject area. The scenario goes on to say that there is no formal learning program for this subject and that individuals have been encouraged to do their own research, share their research and knowledge, and so learn from and with each other. So basically, it's an informal learning process around this topic. And to support this informal learning process, you as an L&D professional have been asked to curate 6 different learning resources that are varied and which complement each other, and to make these available via an appropriate method or platform. Again, another note, your platform could be as simple as email. You could just share these resources via email, but ideally we'd like you to consider something more sophisticated for sharing this software. So it might be for sharing your resources, so it might be a particular software or platform. Don't be too worried about this. The task only requires you to identify and explain your chosen platform. So you might find something that you think this would be great to use, but there's no way you can actually access and use it. That doesn't matter. All we want to know is what platform would you like to use? How would you choose to share these resources if there was no limit on this? So don't worry about actually having to share them via some sophisticated platform. So we've got this scenario, an informal learning process in which you've been asked to curate 6 different learning resources. Remember that they should be varied and they should complement each other. Key aspects of curation there. The task goes on to give a few more instructions, and these are important because this is now we're getting into the evidence that you would need to provide from this task. So first of all, we want a written response for task 2. And in that written response, you should explain the resources you've chosen and why you've chosen these and why you're combining these, why you've chosen these. Remember that aspect of being varied and complementary? Why have you chosen these? Why do these fit together well? So your 6 resources need explaining. We also want you to, in your explanation, what sort of platform would you use, ideally, to share them? So we want a brief explanation of the method or platform you would ideally use to share these curated resources and why. And again, it's what you would use in an ideal scenario. You don't have to use that. You're just going to have to attach these items. So that takes us into the second box there, the orange box. So having done your explanation of your resources, a little bit about the resources and why you chose them, and the platform you would ideally use, you are then asked to simply attach your chosen 6 curated items to your assignment. And we don't need you to attach huge videos or huge documents or podcasts. We don't need the whole thing here. What we need is some kind of title page or screenshot, photo, whatever, that shows what your 6 items would be. So we want an identifiable extract of each of your 6 items, unless they can easily be attached as a whole. But we don't want this file making huge, so just attach front pages, photos, screenshots, etc. So that's task 2, an interesting task, one where you can let your creativity go, think about whatever your topic is, choose your topic wisely, choose something that's interesting and gives you room to choose interesting materials to curate. And then think about yourself as the learner. What would inspire you? What resources would you need or be inspired by? Come up with 6 interesting resources that fit together well, that are varied and complementary. And as it says there, attach some identifiable extract of those so we can see your thinking as a curator. When you've completed task 2, and of course task 1, you then should have a certain amount of evidence, and that evidence must consist of a number of things. So we've already talked about this, but to summarise, for task 1, you should have written responses to each of the 9 questions. And remember the word count there. And for task 2, you should have again a written response in which you explain your resources and your ideal platform. A word count there as well. You have 1,200 words for doing that. And of course, we also want attached to that assignment something that represents or shows the 6 resources you would choose to curate. And these are not included in the word count. So you've got 2,700 words for task 1 and another 1,200 words for task 2. But your identifiable extracts of curated resources don't have no inclusion in the word count, so you don't have to worry about that. Just a little bit of guidance before we finalise the webinar. Things to think about in all your assignments are that you read all the instructions carefully and read them in advance. Remember to get that big picture before you start. Always respond clearly and directly to the questions. We do sometimes find that learners waste quite a lot of words writing about something that is irrelevant to the question. When you do have a limit on these words, there's a lot of questions to get into that word count. So make sure you respond directly to the question. Make sure your responses are easily accessible to your tutor or assessor, that we can see which question, which assessment criteria you're responding to. So you might do something like example 1 there, where you show the question above your response as a kind of subheading. Or you might choose something more redacted like the example below. It doesn't matter as long as you make it very clear which question you're responding to. We would always encourage you to include the AC reference, as that always helps us know what you're responding to and that you realise that there are assessment criteria there and that they all have to be addressed. Remember the thing that we've talked about a lot in this webinar, to include evidence of wider academic reading, show that you have read around your subject, refer to other people's thinking as well as your own, and finally, just make sure you comply with those evidence and word count requirements. So when you've taken all that on board and completed task 1 and task 2, your assignment should be complete. Couple of admin things though just to think about, and they are that, have you added your name and learner number? Is it clear on your assignment who you are and who wrote the assignment? Your name and learner number should be there. Have you proofread the assignment? Have you provided a clear layout, back to those subheadings and AC refs? Have you complied with word count? So just check it before you finish. And finally, and this is particularly important, make sure you submit your assignment on time. When you have complied with all of that, everything we've talked about here, you will have completed your assignment. Well done. And at this point in the webinar, you have now reached the end of the webinar. So thank you for staying with us. We do hope you've found it helpful. And if so, please note that there are recorded webinars for other units within the CIPD suite of qualifications, and certainly for the 3 pathway units within the CIPD Associate Diploma in Organisational Learning and Development. Thank you.